Plain Truth, a show where we try to get into some of the mysteries and anomalies in the dirty underbelly of the world around us. I'm your host, Paul, and joining us this week, we have Joaquin Flores. Joaquin, are you there?
Hi, how you doing, Paul? I'm here.
Oh, good. Thanks for coming. Now, you've been with Syncretic Studies, a think tank, and you've worked in like the Eurasian movement. You've been an advisor in politics, so you've done quite a bit, right?
Yeah, I'm here based in Belgrade, Serbia, and I worked with the Radical Party and advised them in their last political campaign. Also with the Eurasian movement, which is led by Alexander Dugin. In the U.S., we advise a small activist network called New Resistance, and they're gaining some ground, making some headway, and that's the life of an analyst and a consultant.
And an activist.
And an activist, right.
Yeah. Okay, well, Joaquin, thanks for coming. And along for the interview today is my friend Jerry. Jerry, are you there?
Hey, guys. Thanks for joining us again, Joaquin.
Hi. Thanks. Glad to be with you.
Okay, well, Joaquin, as we speak, we've had another, I don't know if this is the 6th or 7th or whatever, ceasefire in the Ukraine. Boy, there must be peace in the world coming one of these days.
Hey, I hear it everywhere. We got to give peace a chance, Paul.
Exactly. Well, I have faith in Poroshenko and Obama and Kolomoisky. Boy, I'm sure they want peace.
They've got to want peace. They talk about it so much. It's got to be the main thing that they're working for.
Exactly. So where do you see things going?
Yeah, I mean, with the ceasefire, you know what I'm going to say. There was never a ceasefire. This is a retreading of the old script from last month with Israel. There was never a ceasefire. Now, what happens is after a few major battles and one side gets so thoroughly licked that they've got nothing left to throw, yeah, the hostilities kind of stop for a few days or a few weeks, right? But that's not a ceasefire. That's like a loss, right? So, I think, but both sides for different reasons, and I think that's the important thing, that for different reasons, in their own use of tactics within their broader strategy, they felt that it was conducive to talk about a ceasefire. It might have been what Europeans wanted to hear. I think it helps. It generates some interest in the news cycle. Both sides get to look like they're interested in peace, which creates the illusion among denizens of the world that their leaders want peace. And of course, that's not true. And so that's what we're left with. But there was never a ceasefire. I mean, hostilities continued. The Novorossiyan army was engaged in a few different cleanup operations, squeezing and clamping down on some of these encirclements, and were able to push into some other areas and maybe trying to set up a defensive position to keep a next wave of Kiev assault that may occur coming, say, from a regroupment in Kharkov. And that's what we're looking at right now. That was what was really behind the so-called ceasefire. That never happened.
Well, a question is, all of the, this gets into the whole information war. A whole big issue is how this works, not just to the broader public, but how does it work for your supporters, right? And a question I have with this is, I think, for example, Pavel Gubarov resigned over it. Mm-hmm. And there's a certain element, I mean, the Novorossiyan army, a lot of them are volunteers from different places, right? Like maybe Kharkov, for example, but, maybe Serbia. And, they're going there because they're motivated, right? They're going there because their heart's on the line. In the case of somebody from Kharkov or Odessa, they're going there because they want their towns liberated too. And also revenge, frankly. Let's just put it this way. In Odessa, they had a massive pogrom. Burning, gassing, raping, all kinds of terrible things.
It's personal.
it's personal, is what I'm trying to say. They want the people in Kiev or Kolomoisky, they want them dead as doornails. They want revenge.
That's right.
And so what that means in practice is if you say, or you let the image come out, that we're kind of willing to leave it like it is now in a non-peace, non-war state for 6 months or a year or something because Russia kind of benefits from an unsettled situation, then that, I think, would be demoralizing to your own supporters. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's the thing is that what's going. I do have thoughts, right?
By the way, let me interrupt briefly and just say, look, I think, as you said, the ceasefire won't happen anyway. Okay, that probably as we speak, they're shooting on both sides, but just in terms of the morale factor or something.
Yeah. What happens is you have basically different types of supporters, and two types of the supporters are the people actually fighting on the ground, and then you have activists who are involved in various levels, fundraising, in social media, propaganda work, and so forth. So you have volunteers who are in Rostov or on the Russian side who are putting together these caravans and these humanitarian packages and helping with other things too, and we'll leave it at that. So there's different types of activists, right? And so the messaging is different, and it's targeted differently at different groups. And what in organizing, because we're talking now about political organizing, there's a certain word I'll introduce. It's called inoculation. And inoculation is a process that we use in political organizing when we get all of our supporters and we tell them what it is that they're going to hear, say in a few days or next week or next month, and why it is that it's being said, and why it is that that's not the thing to believe. And so we inoculate our supporters and tell them we're going to be saying that we're say in this case doing a ceasefire, and this is the reason why. And if you can, the inoculation occurs, of course, beginning at an official source, but it's disseminated at first to a small group, and as the small group disseminates the inoculation into wider and wider circles, it must be credible because people believe they're friends, and everyone is communicating from friend to friend to friend to friend. But the more that it disseminates, the farther it is from the original source. And then so when the other side is trying to intercept and interpret messages and information coming from the other side, they can't say that the inoculation comes from an official source, and so it becomes very confusing for the other side to determine which is misinformation, disinformation, or accurate, and so forth. So I know it's complex, but to summarize, we target different information at different audiences. We inoculate our supporters in different ways and tell them what to expect.
Okay, that seems fair. And so when we see something like Gubarov resigning, we don't really know what the deal is.
If he's resigning or not, right?
Yeah, I mean, it could be any number of things, but it might not be that he's disappointed. It may just be a cover anyway. It may just be that it's disinfo essentially targeted at the other side.
Right.
I mean, there's no real telling.
Right.
So that certainly is a fact. Speaking of this, I think we might want to go into a lot of changes have happened in the Novorossiyan side. The leadership, military, political, even in this case, Gubarov kind of leaving officially. Can you tell us what's been happening on the Novorossiyan side in the last, 6 weeks or something?
Well, we had, of course, after
we had Strelkov, the famous, image, right? And then he led them out of this surrounded, hopeless situation in the town where they were gradually being getting white phosphorus or whatever and everything else, and they made a daring escape.
Right.
Why don't we start from there?
Yeah, so that was the escape from Slavyansk, I guess we're talking about. That was July 5th. And then you jump forward now 2 months. So we have, 8.5 weeks or more of events. Look, there was an issue. Strelkov really exceeded people's expectations of him. He was a high-ranking commander in the Chechen War, but he was not considered to be somebody who one would charge with ever-increasing responsibilities, I'll say. And it's not that he's bad or incompetent, but, other people's job is to evaluate people's competency, see what they're good at, what they're capable of doing. And so there was some element of there. I would never dream of saying that he was incompetent at all. The man clearly is accomplished great feats that will continue to be studied in military academies for decades to come. And so there should be no doubt that what Shelkov accomplished is going to go down in the annals of history as being a significant victory. It will be studied in military academies for decades to come. And he was creative. He was, one of the first military commanders to combine the use of social networking to confuse the opponent. All of the information about how they were facing defeat at any moment and on their last legs, and the whole militia could crumble. This led the Kiev junta.
You mean he was a good liar?
He was a great liar, and he was great at playing dead. And
yes.
he lured the Kiev junta. He gave them a false sense of confidence all the way up the chain of command, and they pushed in. The Kiev junta overextended, and they ended up getting themselves encircled, having their supply lines cut, and they ended up in these disastrous events for them. But there was some personality problems, not with him, but just how sometimes people rub each other the wrong way and they don't mix. And there was some ideological issues too. Now, to be clear, Strelkov tried very hard to be neutral towards the communist aspect of this uprising, and as you know, he is a monarchist and sympathized, of course, with the whites. He more saw this. His parallels were more with Tsar Alexander or Emperor Alexander versus Napoleon, rather than the Red Army versus the Nazis, right? So, and that's historical stuff, but it's also ideological. And there were just people that he couldn't mesh well with. And basically, those people refused to be under his command, not just Vostok Battalion, but others, and not for reasons necessarily that we've come to see. It wasn't necessarily surrounding the issues with Kurginian. So it was, these were broader issues of creating basically the goal, to back up a little bit, coming out of Slavyansk and moving forward these last 2 months, was to bring all these militias into a real armed forces, which meant being under a centralized command. And it was determined that Strelkov was not up to the task for that. Maybe he objectively had those qualifications. I'm not one to say, but it was obviously determined by others that he was not, and that's how I would summarize that.
If I could make a brief observation, Joaquin, it seems like Strelkov was removed shortly after he made a statement essentially saying the oligarchs should have their wealth nationalized in Novorossiya. Do you think that played a part in it? Because I'm wondering if there's maybe some type of backroom deal struck with Akhmetov, and if maybe that sort of rubbed things the wrong way, so to speak.
Yeah, Akhmetov, Kurginian, they presented, a case for why Novorossiya should strike a deal with Kiev, end the hostilities, and move towards federalization, right? Whereas Strelkov and others were pushing that Novorossiya had to be its own republic, maybe integrate into the Russian Federation, but absolutely an independent state from Kiev, right? And so I think you're right that was part of it. Issues though are that what appears as two different strategies or two different approaches are not necessarily there. It would be more accurate to say that that both of these different competing approaches both wanted to see the same result, which was a regime change in Kiev, and there were just different ideas about how to accomplish that, and if it was prudent or not for Russia to actually acquire more than just Crimea. And so that's what those disputes revolved around. But they all agreed that the Kiev junta had to go, and that all of Ukraine had to be at the very least neutralized. There's probably no going back to August of last year, and you know, the experiment with Yanukovych will never be repeated again. Any lasting, stable future Kiev government will, as far as Russia is concerned, have to be unabashedly pro-Russian.
That begs the question, do you think federalization is even a remote possibility at this point? I mean, I can't see how they would want to be affiliated with Kiev at all, but I mean, do you think there's any hope for federalization?
Not with anything resembling the present Kiev junta, not with anything that resembles how the Ukrainian constitution has been construed or interpreted. So yeah, you know, you're right about that. What people are talking about though is that there would need to be. I'm gonna sort of try to frame it like this. What has happened in the east of the country is a combination of a national liberation struggle and a class struggle, and that's always a very difficult thing to juggle. The national struggle can spill over into a class struggle, and then you see some of the problems that arose in other historical examples, such as in the Spanish Civil War, right? So if the class struggle is prematurely heightened, or if it takes too much of a role, then what it does is it pushes those on the same side as of the national struggle as you, but they might be from a higher economic class, and so then they will stop seeing that they have a common cause, and they might even go over to the other side if they think that that's better, right? So we saw that happen in the Spanish Civil War in the 30s, and that was the difficult role that the Republican forces had to deal with. And I think the analogy really fits because it's a recent enough historical example. Of course, we're dealing with different technologies and different doctrines in war. That was, you know, a time between second and third generation war, and now we're clearly crossing over into the threshold of fourth generation war. But I still think that the analogies hold. And so what they need to do with Kiev is they need to transform what was a sort of national struggle of talking about Maidan, of a national assertion of Ukrainian identity, and the Russians and Ukrainians, right, from the working class and the artisan class and the small businesses need to come together into a popular front and engage in a class struggle and basically overthrow the oligarchs, Poroshenko, and that's gonna mean that they have to also push against the Pravi sector. Can they do that? That's very difficult. You know, the Communist Party of Ukraine has been charged with opportunism, and I think that's fair to say, the mainstream party. Now, the radical elements of the Communist Party of Ukraine, of course, in the east of the country, are the ones that broke off. They have strong criticisms of the official Communist Party of Ukraine. They too are communists, but they're engaged, of course, in what they see as a revolution and are parts of these militias that have coalesced into an armed force. So I'm not trying to create too complex of a map. I think it's fairly simple to understand now that you have, on the one hand, in the West, a need to transform, for the Russians, to be able to transform a national struggle into a class struggle in order to overthrow the Kiev junta, not from an assault from Novorossiya, but from within. And that's only going to happen through military victories, but not just on the Novorossiyan side, but of course over in the west, Transnistria increasing their pressure, some sort of way to break a valve and get into Odessa. But the communists must rise up in Odessa, and and the left, a popular front of left forces, must rise up in Ukraine. Now that may be very difficult, of course, because the Kiev junta is a fascist regime, and it's not fascist just in the corporatist, vague sense, without putting any moral attachments to that, but rather there are people who enjoy hurting people. I want to say misanthropes who are employed by the Kiev state, who consider themselves National Socialists, who revel in things like torture and killing people, women and children. I don't want to get graphic, but we saw what happened in Odessa already, and that may happen in Kiev. So that's how I would frame that.
Well, Joaquin.
Oh, go ahead, Paul.
Okay, Joaquin, a couple things from that, though.
Yeah.
First of all, the disaster in the Ukraine currently, and many of us saw this coming. I mean, I thought that there was a good chance this would happen, 5 or 10 years ago, because the country was circling into degenerate oligarchy.
Right.
And oligarchy leads itself into violent fascism because there's nothing else. What I mean? There's no other ism for the country, right? Other than radical nationalism to distract you from the fact that the country in front of you is falling apart and everything's being stolen and whatever, right?
Yeah, and to put down popular forces.
Right, and so what's his name? One of the presidents and oligarchs, Kuchma, even wrote a book like Ukraine is not Russia. So he's promoting Ukrainian, nationalism.
Right.
And the whole Ukrainian thing is fundamentally a very anti-Russian thing. Because there's nothing else to it. In other words, you have a choice. Like you're saying, you could have a class struggle, you could have a religious, moral struggle, you could have all kinds of things. But the only thing the oligarchs want is a fascist anti-Russian struggle.
Right.
So we're kind of, I guess what I'm trying to say is the oligarchical issue is terrible because that's the cause of the problem, and that's the fear many of us have had, is that the oligarchs in Russia, who are not totally vanquished by any means, right? Want some kind of deal. And looking at the whole start of this war in Novorossiya, like you were saying, it was like a holographic war for the first, 2-3 months.
Right.
And you couldn't help but feel that it was just a bunch of oligarchs sitting around tables. And,
right.
And including Russian ones, or like Putin's friend, Medvedchuk or whatever, the guys inside the Ukraine. And you just have this feeling like, how do you come up to any kind of compromise? Because Russia's been comfortable with the system they had in the Ukraine. You know what I mean?
Right.
In other words, the problem is partly because Russia was contented with it. And I think this was stupid, but I'm just saying it does seem to be that way. Any thoughts on that?
It's you're right. Look, there's an impasse here. Something's got to give, right? The question is what and how. So, what I do in my analysis is I had to learn along the way, Paul, that the way that we were taught criminology in popular culture is entirely wrong. And I'm going to connect these dots if you just give me a second.
Sure, go for it.
The British writer Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote about Sherlock Holmes, and in these stories, he's always consulting Watson, right? And what Holmes shows the public, and this was a significant feat of disinformation that Doyle played on the public, was that they showed that the way that crimes are solved is that you don't reach any conclusions and you just go where the facts lead you. and only at the very end do you determine who was the guilty party. And this is not at all how it works. You begin first with a theory of who it is, and then you force all the facts to fit that theory, and that's how basically every conviction goes down. That leads to a lot of problems, and it leads to false convictions. How this plays out, the connection to geopolitics, is that what you do really is what people do, and these different analysts, and why you see people disagree, why you have different popular bloggers and analysts and writers and military analysts who have different audiences, is that they already have in their mind a working theory of how this whole game works, and then they are finding the facts that fit that. And if they find facts that don't quite fit their narrative, they try to explain why this is an exception. And so you can see which theories are better that have to create less exceptions. The ones that have to keep creating, to borrow from the problems with the geocentric theory of the solar system, right? You had these ideas where they had to build these epaulets to explain the irregularities and all how the sun and the planets went around the Earth, and they started to build epaulets into epaulets into epaulets to explain. They had this mounting body of contradictory evidence before they could approach a paradigmatic shift. And so the problem we're facing now is that there are some analysts who think that Putin is himself some oligarch ready to sell out Russia and its peripheral struggles at any given time. And so they're looking to fit all those facts to that narrative, and they end up, confusing themselves and their readers all the time. I'm not going to mention names, but, I think we know who we're talking about. And then there are others who think that Poroshenko wants to see an end to the war and is looking for a deal, and then so they're looking at all the ways that can be explained. My bias, right? And hey, this will maybe be my undoing in terms of analyzing this properly. But my sense is that the U.S. wants to create a failed state in Ukraine, and that is their objective, say, for this foreseeable couple of years. And to just keep an ongoing low to mid-level intensity conflict that will really destroy a lot of the infrastructure of Ukraine, that will cost either Europe or Russia, and together Russia and Europe, billions of euros to rebuild. Damage to the pipeline, of course, they're working for ways around that, but damage to the pipeline, damage to the relationships, to instill distrust. Once someone's brother gets killed, I'm talking about within the population now. Once someone's brother gets killed, then you have these ongoing problems of cycles of revenge, just like in, say, gang warfare in cities like New York or Los Angeles, where COINTELPRO was able to break up, Young Lords or Black Panther Party and break them up into gangs of, never-ending internecine rivalries. They're doing this in Ukraine. They did it between Sunnis and Shias in Iraq, and they're doing it now in Syria. So these problems will last for the next 30 or 40 years. Once, someone's killed someone, you killed my mom and now I'm going to get you, it never ends, right? It goes on at least 40 or 50 years. And that's what the U.S. has been successful, I think, in accomplishing in Ukraine. So if nothing else, you're going to have all this damage to repair. But they want a never-ending conflict.
Can I ask a hypothetical, Joaquin?
Please.
Do you think Russia should have just moved in straight away instead of kind of supporting an insurgency? And do you think, in hindsight, that maybe they regret not doing that?
No and no. I think that they are pursuing the most prudent course. I think they're winning this. So I don't think that they have regrets right now. All of the objective data and criteria was on their side. It was theirs to lose. Nothing. The future's not written. but I think that when they ran all of their analytics and looked at all of their objective data and their best intuition from people whose job it is to have great intuition, indicated that they would be able to pursue a position. They didn't want this, right? So much of what's happening is in the first place not optimal for them. They didn't bring this, this was brought to them, but they had planned for this scenario, and they had really 2 decades, right, to work through this. And the only things they really had to change in their plan in the last 6 or 7 years was the increased role of social networking and the alternative media and the information war, which has changed. When we talk about fourth generational warfare, talking about that as well. So that's really what's had to be built into the plan. And I think that they've done that fairly well, at least as far as giving bad information to the Kiev junta about what the militia really thinks and what their strengths are. They absolutely foiled them. The Kiev junta,
Joaquin, though, this is one of the topics for today with the information war and advanced,
right,
memes and other things. But, I hear what you're saying about their planning and contingencies and all that, and I think they're good. And so far, this has played out in kind of a tactical sense very well for Russia. But I still have my doubts because this whole mess shouldn't have happened in the first place, it seems to me. And like when you say what has changed in the last few years, didn't the rise of the paramilitaries take place under Yanukovych or whatever? I mean, in the last 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and that's a huge change. It meant that the violent side now had armies ready to go that were under the direct pay of, let's say, Kolomoisky, right? Not under Yanukovych, right?
Right.
And they were radical and violent, and then they also had the football hooligans for the lower level stuff, right?
Yes.
And so it seems to me like when you say nothing's changed in the last 5 years or something, that was a dramatic change that really meant from the get-go, the Russian side had nothing like it.
Okay, right. Let me tackle that in 2 ways. The rise of paramilitary groups, I think that they had increased legitimacy in the last 5 or 6 years, but this was due to an increase of funding from the U.S. The Russians saw this happening. Seeing something happening and properly analyzing it and trying to build your best contingencies around that is not the same thing as having the power to stop it. So I think that we have to understand that Russia today is, not the Soviet Union, and even the Soviet Union was not the all-powerful behemoth that, the McCarthyists told us that it was, right? And Russia today is not even as strong as the Soviet Union was at its peak, say, in the 60s or early 70s. And so, look, they saw this coming. They approach these things through intelligence networks. So much of what's happening on the Kiev side is just so infiltrated on so many levels that, explaining these astounding Novorossiyan victories in no small part had to do with the fact that the Russians had superior intelligence. I mean, we don't really have examples except maybe, Boers fighting Zulus or the German blitzkrieg into Poland, where you see, these 10-1 and 20-1 losses, not just in small battle, but in the overall theater. The Kiev forces have been obliterated. There's maybe been 1 to 3,000 Novorossiyan militia lost in conflict, and there's been between 15 and 25,000 lost on the Kiev side, with another 10 or 15,000 having defected, being AWOL or taken prisoner in some way. And this is unheard of, right? So this is like a real shock, I think, for the West. I don't think they expected this, to be honest.
Yeah, but Joaquin, I think we're kind of discussing different things here. What you're arguing, and I agree with, is that after essentially this shock hit Moscow once the Maidan, became obvious that it wasn't, they weren't even going to wait for the election or anything. They were going straight putsch, Nazi takeover kind of thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
It shocked the system and it responded in Moscow in many ways. Like you talk about, they created a super NGO for handling things, and they did a lot of things, I'm sure, right? But what I'm trying to say is before that, and many say this, I mean, Mark Sloboda, a well-known guy on Russia Today and other places, who has family from the Crimea, his wife's family from Crimea and eastern Ukraine, essentially has argued this, that yes, they're doing a very good job now, but they really truthfully did not handle, the last, 5 or 10 years very well. They didn't use soft power very well. And I realize that Russia is not as powerful as the Soviet Union in its prime, but I mean, the Ukraine is a country right next door. Everybody knew that it was basically Russia's weak point. And so if they had the energy to infiltrate the paramilitaries, then they really should have had the energy to, I don't know, but let's say have Russia Today, spreading, the equivalent of Russia Today, spreading information around the Ukraine or whatever it is they needed to do.
Right.
And I think that you have to say several things. One is they've been pushing this idea of international law and non-intervention too much.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's just unrealistic when the U.S. wants to take your resources.
Right.
But I think the other point, one more point though, and this is a tougher one, is that I think the Russian elite are divided, and that's why you see things like Russia basically more or less double-crossed Iran and then allowed the war in Libya.
Yeah. Well, Iran. Yeah. Look, you presented a difficult quandary. I'm going to try to answer the question as best as I can. I don't think that Russia double-crossed Iran. I think that Iran is a regional hegemon there. We won't get off the topic too much, but just to understand what, talking about the S-300s or S-400s to Iran, if that's the double cross, the issue is that Iran has its own trajectory and it has its own interest. And, Iran has done some really, really interesting things. And I know that we tend to want to see Iran as part of a broader anti-imperialist struggle and being allied in some way with Russia and perhaps China and definitely Syria. But, let's not forget that Iran has its own interest. The Russians did not want to see Saddam Hussein overthrown, and the Iranians did. And the Iranians did help in their own way the Americans to do that. And keep in mind that not only Shalabi, but also Muqtada al-Sadr are both, Iraqis who are really Iranians who own property and own homes and live in Iran actually most of the year and are protected by the Iranian elite. And,
Hey, I'm with you on it, Joaquin. I'm with you on this. Like you, I lived in Los Angeles many years, and there are lots of Iranians there. And I think you can easily see and talk to them and realize, even ones who are not rich and oligarchical, that, Iran could easily turn into an American ally.
Easily, yeah. I mean, the neocons wrote about this in the 90s, and I don't know if it was Crystal or Wolfowitz who argued that Iran was the real ally of the U.S. in the Middle East. And then also keep in mind that Iran sent its special forces to aid the Bosniaks against the Serbs, and the Serbs were kind of, pro-Russian, even though Yeltsin was not helping them. But then, Putin came to power at the end of that conflict. Putin really ended that war. It was, by sending in the paratroopers, and they paraded through Belgrade and they marched down to the south. and brought back to life a old Serbian military base, and that's what ended the 78 days of bombing during Operation Merciful Angel in 1999. But it was the Iranians were on the opposite side of that conflict. They were on the American side. They sent in special forces to help the pro-American Bosniaks. So that's real complicated. You know, I have sympathies for Iran. I definitely support Iran in its struggles that it faces today, and they've been fantastic with regard to Syria and with regard to Lebanon and Hezbollah, and no one can take that away from them. And, you know, of course, they've made just amazing and laudatory achievements over the past 20, 30 years in their own economic and social development. I you know, can't say anything bad about that. I'm just being a realist. So that may explain, you know, hey, why would Russia not want to put its latest, you know, or near latest technology in the hands of a country which, you know, who knows what is going to happen with them, right? So with the Saudis showing signs of some overture to Iran, and, you know, Russia trying to have some influence over Egypt with Sisi, and, you know, Saudi Arabia trying to claim that they're not backing ISIS and so on. It's, you know, who knows what the trajectories are. I'm not a Mideast expert. I don't claim to be. I only know probably
Hey, Joaquin.
You know. Yeah.
Joaquin, I agree with all you said, but I think it's kind of missing the context that
Right.
Medvedev came in and really wanted to suck up to the West is the bigger picture, really. And you have this constant fight in the elite in Russia over to what extent they want to be friends with Europe.
Right.
And I think that was the context of it. I think that Iran was just an issue of that. And then so they did other things. They allowed the U.S. to destroy Libya, for example. And it's part of this context of the factional fighting in Russia's elite.
Yeah, both the Saudis and Iran hated Gaddafi.
Yeah.
And so, you know, and the Baathists, you know, the Iraqis, the old Iraqis hated Gaddafi. Gaddafi.
Well, that's how you know. Hey, Joaquin, that's how you know you're in the Middle East. Is in all directions, everybody hates the country you're in.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, that's why Gaddafi was trying to angle towards the African Union and try to redefine Libya as an African power. And he was basically like, you know, F the Arab League, man. Like, this is just nuts. You know, and even as such, Gaddafi was, even when you had Pan-Arabism, of course, Gaddafi really modeled his own successes after Nasser. But, you know, even he had issues with Pan-Arabism, and Pan-Arabism, in my opinion, and Gaddafi's opinion, was, you know, heads and shoulders above all of this, you know, internecine Shia Sunni shit, right? So excuse my French there, but but to get back to your original point, you know, you make a good one, and I agree with you that in retrospect there were some shortcomings in how Russia dealt with Ukraine. I think that's the point that you're making. Our colleague Mark Sloboda has said that. That's a fairly accurate assessment. We may not agree on the extent of what was possible, right? But it certainly exposes a real weakness, right? Russia is not a superpower. They have limited ability to project power, even in their own historic sphere of influence, right? And I think they did the best that they could. I guess my difference, right, is that I don't think that they really could have done more. Given, you know, I take my ideas a lot from Kuhn's theories of scientific revolution paradigms, and within their paradigm, you have to explain things from the point of view of their paradigm. And I think that I think that the Russians have gone through the past 4 or 5 years a paradigmatic shift. I mean, they were kind of late in coming out with RT. I mean, RT should have come out when HBO came out, right? Like in the 80s, right? I mean, so it's they're doing a lot of catch up, but it's explainable within their paradigm. You know, Russians have been very slow to absorb the Freudian and Bernaysian revolution in marketing and advertising. I think that would be a fair criticism to level.
Joaquin,
Yes,
what
sir.
what do you think about the timing of this peace treaty? Do you think it was sort of time to take the wind out of the sails of the NATO conference?
It really was. I think that that's an apt description of what the motivations were on the Russian side. The question then would be is why did the Ukrainians agree to pretend to talk about peace?
That was
Why
my
would you
next
think that would
question.
be? Right? Yeah. So, you know, uh, they they actually are trying to maintain order in their own house, and everyone smells defeat, and defeat smells really really bad. And so sometimes you try to take an air freshener and just kind of spritz it around the room, and that's what Poroshenko was trying to do with his version of the ceasefire. Uh, in other words, it's kind of like you run out of money, right? And you're trying to hide that fact, so you say, "Oh, I don't feel like buying that." It's like he uh, he couldn't throw anything else, right? I mean, he had nothing else to throw. So it's like, yeah, ceasefire. It's kind of like, yeah, I meant to do that. So
Just an act of desperation, more or less.
an act of desperation to cover up the fact that they had no alternative. Uh, I mean, if he didn't, talk about a ceasefire, how else would he explain the fact that there's no forward movement of their operations? Oh, we put it on pause. I mean, why not take the credit of being seen as a person interested in pursuing peace?
Hey, Jerry, you know that they were serious about it because Senator McCain went to Kiev. They were working on the peace plan. Don't you know?
Well, I've got another. I don't know if it's a question or a statement, but I'd like to hear what Joaquin thinks about it. I've read, and I don't know if actually sold his Russian business to Yanukovych's son. Is that true?
Yeah, he sold. Well, part
What
of it.
the hell?
It is
Like
true.
Yanukovych. I mean, it
Well,
just doesn't.
Poroshenko had some connection with Yanukovych before. I mean, he's been
Hey,
in different
yeah,
cabinets. They're all oligarchs, and they all
they're
work
all. This
together.
is really incestuous, and Yanukovych. Look. He was the party of regions for a reason. I mean, uh, he was the compromise candidate, right? He had friends on both sides before there were two clear sides. So, I'm not surprised by that. And there are also reasons why, and I want to touch back on the point raised about the Russians talking about how they pushed this issue of the legality and international law too much. Well, let's remember, guys, there's something that they didn't push too much, which is that Yanukovych is the only constitutional leader of Ukraine and still is, and he never stepped down, and he never said I relinquish my authority, and the Russians have been completely silent about that. So they haven't really pushed this. They haven't pushed the legality of Poroshenko's regime. They said that they would welcome the elections, and they played this game very differently from how one might expect if they were purely pushing legality.
Well, make a couple points. The first point is I don't think Yanukovych was exactly the Russians' best friend.
Nope.
And secondly, I think maybe Poroshenko is getting ready to pull a Saakashvili and move to Washington or something.
I think you're right. And in the past week, I've been working on a working hypothesis about one possible scenario. I may publish this in the next couple days. So if you guys get this out before I do, then you've got the scoop on it. No one else has said what I'm about to say. No one else. People have probably, in the crevices of their mind, considered the possibility, but haven't verbalized it. And whenever you're ready, I can tell you one big twist, one way this could go that I don't think people have quite yet considered.
Go for it.
Well, now again, this is only a possibility. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying this is what's going to happen, because it's a big stretch but not of the imagination, but it just relies on too many contingent factors that haven't played out yet. But if the Novorossiyan army continues to have these successes, and if they are successful in pushing on Kharkov, and if there is some concerted effort on the Transnistrian side that helps to coordinate a push on Odessa, keeping in mind that Anfuyev is the former, who's now in control of internal security matters in the state in Novorossiya, comes from Transnistria, so he has all the connections to coordinate the Novorossiyan effort and the Transnistrian effort. He's kind of like the general of coordinating Transnistria with Novorossiya. That would be the push on Odessa. Now, under those circumstances, right, you would see a near total collapse of any legitimacy of the moderates, in scare quotes there, of Poroshenko. The U.S. would then possibly, now this is, I'm just going out on a limb here, guys, but it's something that no one has considered, in my opinion. Imagine that the U.S. will covertly back a coup of entirely extreme far-right forces. No more, skinny bureaucrats wearing glasses, and no more European suits and stuff like that. We're talking about just the Yadosh crowd, okay, coming to power. The U.S. backing that as a coup in Kiev, in a state of total collapse where Novorossiyan forces have, maybe made a complete land bridge all the way to Odessa, or maybe even before this. And the U.S. covertly support this while publicly claiming that they're against this. So you would have Obama saying, we're alarmed at the, at this change of events, that we support the moderates. If there's some way to support Poroshenko to come back, we want this. So then we'll see a shift where the pro-Atlanticist Europeans can pretend that they're echoing or joining sides with the Russian sympathetic European elites and joining with Russia to condemn this new far-right junta in Kiev. Would be truly a Kiev junta in every sense of the word. And then covertly the U.S. is supporting it while pretending that they're against it, and then trying to trick the Russians in some way, or to work around them to have a NATO effort to overthrow the Kiev junta as a guise to secretly support them, and even maybe NATO bombings in the parts of Novorossiya, which are in the southwest of Ukraine, going towards Odessa, talking about the march from Mariupol west, but in fact actually bombing Novorossiya forces. But this would require certain...
You've just been reading about ISIS, right? The U.S. pretends to bomb ISIS, and
Well, that's the game. That would be taking it from that book. I mean, that's how we've understood ISIS from the very start, right? So I'm just saying that this would be taking that approach and pulling it off in Ukraine, right? Why wouldn't they do that if they had to? I mean, it would for them, they would solve a lot of issues, and it would tend to take the wind out of the sails of the genuine European elites who want normalcy with Russia, and it would put all of the, it would create a lot of confusion between the Europeans, and it would confuse the discourse. And if they can pull this off, at least on the information war level in the Middle East, and I think that in many ways they are on the information war. I think they're losing the ground war, but their information war, they've got people convinced that ISIS is this real thing, and I think a lot of people are convinced that they're bombing ISIS, right? And so,
well, I guess one question would be, air power, air support. The Crimea is awfully close. A lot of planes might have problems, or a lot of missiles might have problems if you want to bomb Odessa.
Right. Yeah. The Air Force thing might be, but the thing is that, it's
Might be a lot. What I'm trying to say is it might be a lot easier to get Kiev than to get Odessa. That's a very interesting thought, because what you're proposing is really just to keep it in a failed state.
That's right.
Of confusion, right? It's not that by bombing a certain amount, you're going to determine the outcome.
That's right.
You would have a hardcore fascist kind of, card carrying brown shirt, Nazi kind of black, SS insignia, government in Kiev, but they couldn't hold the country together very well. Maybe only Kiev and Lvov or something would really truly be held together.
That's right.
And overall, the whole country would be in a state of confusion, economic depression, and business would collapse. And this is all good from the U.S. point of view, because it would cause major problems for Russia, and then secondarily problems for Europe. And then you'd have all these massive immigrants. I mean, you can certainly see the logic.
Yep. Yeah, that's, and again, I'm only going out on a limb here. I'm only posing it as a possibility. It is definitely a known tactic. The U.S. has employed it. It is currently employing it in Iraq and Syria. And it would be an out for them, and it would be not an out of the conflict, but an out of having to back Poroshenko and dealing with the divisions among the Europeans and appearing to be on the right side of the issue of fascism.
Yeah, morally.
Right.
Don't you know the U.S. is a big anti-fascist force?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, hey, they won World War II.
Exactly, but only after Stalingrad.
right.
Only when they decided they had no choice, so they'd better go take half of Europe.
Right.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting thought. One can see, what though, what you're saying. I hadn't really thought about the bombing, but I never really thought of Poroshenko as being a permanent kind of guy.
Right.
Because setting aside U.S. machinations. A lot of what's gone on in the Ukraine over the last, 5 years or so, has kind of set it on a course where you just have to see that it's going to fall apart violently. Even if the U.S. weren't in there, the oligarchical clans were fighting and stealing so much. There are only so many organs and children to sell.
Right.
There are only so much of the old industry, the old Soviet equipment they could sell. You know what I mean?
Right.
They stole everything. There's nothing left to steal.
That's right.
And so they were getting into wars. And, one of the reasons Yanukovych was hated so much is the taxes became so oppressive. I mean, there's like a tax to him, essentially. You know what I mean? A tax to the government. And then there's a Yanukovych tax, right? You have a business and you got to pay 10% or whatever to the government. You got to pay 10% to Yanukovych.
Right. Yeah,
the point is that's money that didn't go to Kolomoisky or Akhmetov or whoever, and they're pissed off. They want, so the oligarchs were in a state of war, which is why they funded Maidan, really.
Yeah, and I think that they're the ones who are looking back, right? Wish they would have just stayed with Yanukovych, because how many of these factories in the east of the country are actually still up and running today? I mean, how many hundreds of millions of dollars have they lost so far? How much infrastructure in the roads? I mean, we got to kind of think beyond the, short concept, the micro concept of a business. But I mean, you've got the people, the workers, the infrastructure, waterways, electrical, roads, all the things that, trucks need to use to get from one factory to the distribution points. I mean, all that is really in a state of disarray. I mean, how much does this really cost the oligarchs? I think they're the ones going,
well, they're going to lose. Many of them are going to lose everything. They're going to lose their lives too. Some of them.
Oh yeah. I mean, that's already in the works.
That's another part of this. But I don't know if it's true. But I saw an article in, I think it was a German website, a news, but a serious news page, that the Russian aid trucks that went into the rebel zones when they left, they were loaded with some factories equipment for some military industrial complex company from that area.
Mm-hmm.
They were loaded with massive amounts, and Germany is a player in this whole war. I mean, I'm not saying for sure that that's true,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not a secret that Eastern Ukraine was a key part of the Soviet military-industrial complex and technological complex. And with the way the economy and the war has been going, you can see how it would be collapsing, and you can see how the Russians would want to, take out as much as they could.
Well, yeah, there were. I mean, when the hostilities broke out, and then the uprisings took place, uh, you know, truth is that there was some looting on both sides and everything. And I think that looting is a pejorative. I think there were expropriations right underway. I think people had red flags in their head and were carrying out what are called expropriations. But there were lots of finished products that were sitting in warehouses that because of the conflict actually couldn't make their way to markets. And I think there's reason to believe that it's credible to think, right, that these trucks came in with things, but also left with things that had already been produced. I don't know if factories were like disassembled and if like actual like machinery that produces things was removed. That's possible too. I mean, that would kind of remind us of World War II, right, when Stalin ordered that factories in the west of the country were disassembled and reassembled over in the east. But it's possible. I think what more likely, because there were credible reports that the trucks left with stuff, that these were finished goods that couldn't make their way to markets and now have made their way to markets, and that of course those funds are going to trickle down back into some ability to fund the Novorossiyan effort, whatever the end game may be.
Hey, Joaquin?
Yes.
Would you be able to comment on how you think the France Mistral deal is going to play out? Do you think Russia's eventually going to get the ships? And do you think that France is just kind of kowtowing to NATO pressure to kind of put the deal on ice?
I think, my first instinct is that France is being asked to do something more than what they've done, and that the least that they're trying to show some sign of solidarity with NATO and agree to that above and beyond these sanctions. France is not going to be involved, in my view, for the foreseeable future in any kind of military effort. I don't, as you know, in NATO has a unified command, but each country is not required to commit actual soldiers. They have a general fund and they have a unified command, but they aren't required to support every action, right? And we've seen that play out before. So I think that is just kind of like, France doing the least that they could do to show some solidarity. The more that France pushes for NATO, I think the more that support for the National Front is going to grow, and the government in France could collapse. Not the state. I'm just talking about the parliamentary layout and who the prime minister is and so forth could collapse, and we could see a change of government if they push the NATO thing too hard. So this is something like a compromise. It's only like what, $1 billion or $2 billion deal. It's not really make or break for anybody. It's
well, even... okay, but it's more damaging to your reputation. You know what I mean? When you talk about weapons contracts, nobody wants to buy weapons and then not get them.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's what Iran said too. It's yeah. But I think it's symbolic, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I think what I'm trying to say is, yeah, it was a symbolic thing. They didn't even say no. They just said we need to wait a while, right?
Yeah,
and we'll pay a fine to wait or something.
Yeah, the fine will be, if they got sued over this, it would cost them the same. And Russia has ways of, look, no one's getting ahead. This is not about the money, right? I think it's what I've tried to explain. But it's look, Russia could build its own ships and they could buy one from someone else. This exercise was just more about building the relationship between France and Russia, right? And so this is symbolic of
Joaquin, It was part of Medvedev sucking up to the West.
That's what I'm saying. Right.
Exactly. Which doesn't make it bad. I'm just trying to say that it wasn't like, as you said, Russia had other options and could nowadays easily build it themselves.
Right. And
what about what's going on with South Stream? It seems like that, you get all this back and forth. 1 minute a country's for it, next minute they're against it. How do you think that's going to play out, Joaquin?
Bulgarians want it, and it's the Atlanticists in the EU are trying to keep it from happening because that, of course, we already know that if South Stream can't happen this is not that it's not going to happen. It's like an inevitability, but this is like all about hedging and psychology and stock markets and this how people perceive the way things are going. So it's all about perception management. South Stream will get built. The Bulgarians have already committed to it. Lavrov's made a firm deal already. I mean, basically, Lavrov came in representing Gazprom, right? And when Lavrov speaks, it's Putin speaking. And so this is beyond Gazprom now. This is like now elevated to the level of Bulgaria's relationship with Russia. Serbia's on board with it. Look, the Italians want it, and the German industrialists who don't want the problems in Ukraine, they want South Stream too. So the headlines are headlines and they serve a purpose. The construction is taking place right now. I mean, you go into Bulgaria and it's 400 kilometers of straight pipe and 200 something kilometers of curved pipe or something like that. So it cuts through Bulgaria and then it curves. But they're building it, It's just it's more similar to the France thing with the battleship and are we going to delay? And I think also Bulgaria, they benefited from allowing the Europeans to help their bargaining position because each time that the Bulgarians have been forced or made it look like they were forced to delay South Stream construction, they got a little bit of a sweeter deal from Moscow. So the only question for me is whether Lavrov's going to go back and say, the deal's not getting any better and do you want problems? Or, okay, we'll make the deal a little bit better if it's going to help you to go against what the Atlanticists in Europe want.
Some people are speculating that all this crap that's been raised because of Ukraine, I mean, it's not hurting America at all. The only people that are getting hurt is the European countries, particularly countries like Germany. Now, some people I've read think that this could lead to a fractioning or a fraying of the NATO alliance. Do you think that's accurate?
Well, I think it's accurate, right, yes. It's all terminological, of course. I mean, the NATO alliance will remain, but the question is, will countries opt out? And I think primarily the question that people are asking is, will Germany opt out of NATO? There are two visions of the European Union, and in one vision, Europe is Europe a nation, whether its capitals in Brussels or elsewhere. Europe a nation as a concept, as a geopolitical bloc, singular bloc, would be autonomous and would be free to choose its trading partners and allies, whether that was DC or Moscow or Beijing or Pretoria, right? So it's the issue is like whether there's two. So the other vision of the European Union is that it's just that it's the occupational force of NATO. It's one big Operation Gladio, so to speak. It's it's the American leave behind occupation of Western Europe in the as an outgrowth of the Cold War and World War II. So these are competing visions, and they're not just theoretical, but I mean oligarchs, so to speak, the elites, the bourgeoisie in Western Europe, both kind of split along these different competing visions. It's obviously more complex than that, but I'm trying to condense this into things that can be explained in language and in time constraints and patience. But I think you're right, and I think what you've seen is probably accurate. Russian strategy has in part invested heavily in this idea that NATO won't be able to act cohesively. Now, people tend to speak in analyzing, it's a problem of how internet works and how media works, because people, want to grab your attention. And when we see a headline that's got a leading paragraph about, NATO exploding or something, I mean, that's going to generate more clicks. But as we've said, NATO countries are not required to involve in every adventure. So it may not lead to a formal destruction of NATO and they all get together and agree to disband it or something as dramatic as that. I mean, if that's maybe 20 years, 10 years away from happening, short of a world war. And but realistically, yeah, I mean, you're going to have NATO countries, singularly say, well, we're not going to, get involved in this Ukraine adventure. Now, if you want to do something more in Africa, in exchange for that, we'll do something more in Africa, or maybe something in the Middle East if it doesn't, ruffle too many feathers there. But I think Africa is a good alternative for NATO intervention for countries which don't want to get involved heavily in Ukraine.
So essentially, some of the countries are just tired of giving, to quote the Polish minister, I think, giving blowjobs to the United States
right.
without getting anything in return.
Yeah, they're not getting anything in return. I mean, it's been said by people far better at this than I am, and I think that they're spot on that it's really both world wars have destroyed Europe and have been basically the key to American success as a global hegemon. It has been that the U.S. has been able to fight wars in Europe or cause wars in Europe in some part that, no matter which way the war went, it was going to lead to the destruction of Europe, which is the destruction of the infrastructure, the means of production, the productive capacity, technological know-how, a drain on human resources, the deaths of millions of people, and that means that U.S. comes out ahead. That would seem to be a similar script that they're playing right now in Ukraine.
Just to go back to Ukraine for a minute, what do you think is going on in Transcarpathia?
That's going to be big. These people are ethnic Ruthenian or Rusin, and they're basically, I mean, not to time travel too much, but there was a time in history when all of Ukrainians, say west of the river, consider themselves Ruthenian, and the word Ukraine just means, of course, the border, and the Carpathians mountains are that border, and so it was really this false construction of the Ukrainian identity, which pulled those Rusins away from considering themselves as Russians, as in Kievan Rus, and created this Ukrainian identity. But that never took hold in these mountainous areas in the west of the country. So moving forward now, how that plays out today is that the Novorossiyan effort has, militarily and politically been very successful in a defensive maneuver which has sapped up and destroyed a lot of the Kiev military force. But politically, this cannot look like an invasion, right? And I've been very reluctant to say that the Novorossiyan army is going to militarily push westward, even if saying west of Mariupol. I think because Mariupol is part of the Donbas region, that it's legitimate politically. It's they can sell that, right? But I don't think they can sell, so to speak, a military push all the way clear to the west, even along the southern corridor of what Putin terms Novorossiya in the broader sense. So what that means, in contrast, is that both in Kharkov in the north, east, and in Odessa, which is connected. Odessa is like the largest city close to this part of Ukraine that we're talking about, Carpathia and Transnistria. These will have to be uprisings. This will be like a repeat of April and May, right? Except with more covert assistance. So it's going to mean some assassinations, taking out police chiefs that are pro-Kiev, disarming, sending in special forces, more like police actions that are going to marginalize Pravi sector, not military, right, but hoodlums and hooligans and football fans who are hardcore Ukrainian nationalists and misanthropes who are going to try to put down these uprisings. I see this as being staged as a class struggle, both in Kharkov and in Odessa, and that's going to tie in the Transnistrian and Transcarpathian angle. So then, of course, there's also the Hungarian angle in that little tiny pocket in the very far west of the country. And as you know, Hungary is showing very, very strong signs of coming over to the Russian position altogether.
Yeah, I was just kind of surprised that they sent some of their tanks to the junta. Like, why do you think they did that? Do you think they were just pressured?
Yeah, they had to. It's similar to the French, thing. That was substantive, though. But it's the second the ruling party now is only able. This is Fidesz, and they're connected to a broader Russian strategy, where before this conflict in Ukraine broke out, the Russian strategy had been to promote center-right, to promote two different types of parties, extreme radical nationalists that had Eurasian sentiments, and then center-right parties that were had significant Eurosceptic elements, but were formally pro-EU. So then they promoted formally the EU center-right parties, and then they also supported the radical nationalist anti-EU and anti-NATO parties to be seen as the extremists, so that the center-right pro-EU parties that had a lot of Eurosceptics in them in their coalition were seen as the moderates and the pragmatic, rational choice, right? And that was Fidesz. But Fidesz success depends on there being Jobbik, right? And Jobbik is the third or fourth largest party in Hungary today, and they completely support the Russian side. And to the extent that Fidesz fails to be as neutral as possible, that's going to lead to Russians ramping up support for Jobbik. So, and Jobbik are the ones who are using their little NGOs and sending in their little miniature versions of aid caravans and stuff to the Hungarian populations in the very, very far west of Ukraine, where there are majority Hungarian populations. And so that could, that's going to be necessary, in short, right, to summarize, for that to intensify, along with a Ruthenian struggle against the Kiev regime. And, another missing piece might be to get some of these groups like in Poland, who are nationalist and anti-Kiev junta, because of course we know what happened with World War II, and to talk about Poland's claim on Ukraine. So this is talking about a scenario of a completely Ukrainian failed state, where the surrounding countries all say that they now have a territorial claim on parts of their former realm.
Well, this is probably a good time to get into what your predictions or hunches or guesses might be about where things are heading.
It's
hard to make predictions, especially about the future.
It's hard to make predictions about the future. I mean, I gave the one scenario that
yes.
is interesting to entertain, because I think that's an important exercise in understanding the news cycle and manipulation of mass publics. How they might do like an ISIS thing. I mean, I said back in January that the Pravi sector was the Al Qaeda of Ukraine, and I meant that in every sense, meaning that they're completely controlled CIA type front. So why would they not be used in a similar tactic if Poroshenko loses all credibility, or as a result of continued Novorossiyan victories and apparently native uprisings that are better reinforced this time in places like, say, Odessa, again reinforced by Transnistria and a struggle in Transcarpathia, and also in the northeast of the country in Kharkov. Those would be two locations that we're going to look at next to see where the things are going to really inflame. I don't think that it's going to be relying on the mimetic level on Novorossiyan military victories. I think we know that, of course, that military victories lead to political changes, but I don't think it's going to be, or nor should it be. I hate to be prescriptive, because that's not normally my angle. I rather am better at explaining clearly why things have happened, proscriptively is difficult to say, because I'm not one to backseat drive. The people making decisions for the Russian side have way more data than I do, and they're way better at this. And I'm just a few people here that I consult with, and it's they've got a whole establishment, and they've got numerous think tanks and study groups, and I fall for Aberdeen paradox groupthink, because people I consult with are similarly like-minded to me, and as much as I try to read and understand and dig into people who think very differently from me as an individual psychologically, it's difficult to do that, right? And that's just a limitation of being an individual. On the other hand, the Russian state is drawing upon far broader intelligence resources, analytics. They're running better programs. They know their own game better than I do. So that's why I stay away from making. Yes.
Oh, for sure. But what about another angle then? What do you think the Russian government would like to see happen?
They would like to see regime change in Kiev.
Right. That's a given. I think anybody has to know that.
Right. So they've already determined that Poroshenko, as part of Our Ukraine operation, is clearly a U.S. agent. But there's something else that happens when a man in power. I mean, I don't want to get too esoteric or abstract, but going back to Xenophon and in his tract on Hero the Tyrant, they explore, this is classical Greek literature. the fact that a man in power is possessed by the power. He does not possess the power; he's possessed by it. And so the political reality on the ground affects his thinking and affects his decision making. And we saw this happen in Afghanistan, right, where the U.S. installed Puppet. Hey, he was what, like an ExxonMobil employee or something? And over the course of years, he stopped wearing the suit. He started wearing this like Afghan stuff, and he began to have to, walk a very difficult line of appeasing people who were absolutely opposed to the U.S. occupation of Afghanistan. And then he eventually had to come out publicly calling for a de-escalation of the occupation. And, there's a possibility that that might happen with Poroshenko. The Russians never closed the door on Poroshenko. They welcomed him with as warm a reception as was possible. Let's not forget that going back to May.
Do you think he's helping the Novorossiyans in wiping out the radical, Nazi battalions? Because some of those losses, 10, 20 to 1, seem like they had to have inside, help.
Yeah. Maybe not directly Poroshenko. I mean, I think that Poroshenko understands that the U.S. doesn't control the Russians, right? The U.S. controls the Pravi sector and Sloboda, who, while distinct from each other, are operating along the same trajectory and are controlled by the same people. I think you're right that he sees them as the bigger threat. He is a, moderate right nationalist Europhile. I think that, he would like to remain in power, right? Power feels good, but then, you don't like being told what to do by people so far away, and to do things which undermine your own power. And all the things that the Americans are telling Poroshenko to do undermine his own power. He may not care so much about political power. That might be how the Americans have assessed him, right? So therefore thinking he'd be willing to do things that are just going to create a failed state in Ukraine. But the longer that Poroshenko has the appearance of power and gets to be on TV and likes to see himself up there and make decisions, and he's there at high-level meetings. He's there with Obama and meeting, and there with Putin, and it's like feels good, right? It's addicting. Everyone says that that's very addictive, and so that's a very interesting angle. Certainly the effect of having all these Pravi sector people embedded in the regular army has created a PR disaster for the Kiev junta, because these punitive operations have targeted civilians, and the regular Ukrainian army wants no part of that. This is, almost entirely the mercenaries from Poland and the U.S. and a few other countries, and of course the Pravi sector and Sloboda militia fighters, who are just rabid and ideological. And the more of them that die, the more that we permanently change the political terrain of a future Ukraine. I mean, these are people who are no longer going to be alive to have friends, go to barbecues, fire their guns, build local cells, have support. I mean, all that goes with it, and then it's,
For sure, but let's though explore a little bit more. So
Sure.
We know that Russia simply can't live with a hostile regime in Kiev. I think that's kind of an easy one to see, that their long-term goal has to be to get rid of that, no matter what structure the country takes.
Right.
Kiev is too close. Lvov
Right.
may be a different matter, right? I mean, that can go to Poland perhaps, but not Kiev. It's too close. And anyway, right there is next to the Russian border. You don't want missiles right there anyway.
Right.
So what do you think other than that? Do you think they're thinking, would they like to keep the country in one piece, or do they want to break it up?
I think that optimally, right, that they would like there to be one Ukraine that is pro-Russian. None of this, buffer zone stuff. When I read that, I'm like, okay, this is like this is like bargaining against yourself. Like, the Russians, that's not what they want. That's like what they kind of already had, and that was the compromise. I mean, they want Ukraine to be part of the Eurasian Union, right? Ultimately, so they don't want half of Ukraine. They need all of Ukraine. Uh, Only because of the force that has happened with the crazy radicals of the Pravi sector. However, on the other hand, if most of those crazy radicals get themselves killed, right, in punitive operations that go all wrong, then it's more possible to have an independent Ukraine whose moderates can deal with the Europeans, won't deal with the Americans, and are generally pro-Russian. And then this would require a 20 or 30 year long period of changing the curriculum and textbooks, of the Russians having more control over the professors in the universities in Ukraine who get tenure, the books that get published, and the way that the Ukrainian identity is reframed. I mean, think about how the Tatar identity is framed in Tatarstan Oblast in Russian Federation, right? It's not a hostile, it's not an anti-Russian identity, right? It's an identity within an identity. So they need to create this idea that Ukrainians are a type of Russian, and that's like a 20 or 30 year long project. They had built this project in the Soviet Union to a certain extent, but the doctrines of the Communist Party, however, were to promote this idea of independent nations within the Soviet Union, which I think was necessary, but of course had weaknesses. I mean, this is a similar problem to what happened in Yugoslavia. So again, ideally, of course, Kiev needs to be completely pro-Russian, and Europe, and I mean, Russia likes its friends to be integrated in the European Union. It would like to create, one big economic bloc from Iberia to Siberia. So, this is like similar to Serbia. And I've described before Serbia as like a reverse Ukraine, where it's happening the other way. I mean, all the things that the U.S. is doing in Ukraine are the things that Russia is doing in Serbia. So it's, both struggles are about removing the U.S. influence from Europe-Russia bilateral relations.
Well, that though raises a lot of questions because, I mean, first of all, we can get into the history. I mean, the Soviet Union took in Galicia, which many would argue was a terrible, terrible mistake.
Yeah.
Okay. And so it seems to me it's like, I hate to pick on people from there, but let's say that because it's not, poison isn't the right word, but I mean, they're rabid, right? They are angry. They lost World War II and they want revenge. And, to me, the answer with that is it's you want them in a different room. You don't want them in your room.
Right.
And the other thing is historically they were part of the Austrian or Polish or Lithuanian world a lot longer than they were the Russian world. So, historically it's not like this is a recent thing. They never really thought of themselves as Russian. Now I understand about in Carpathia, that's different, but I'm talking about Lvov. I'm talking about around Lvov, okay?
I'm sure, right.
And I just think it was a mistake to take them in then. They've poisoned things. They've taken over Kiev. Most of the people in the government now, or half of them are from there. And they're rabidly anti-Russian, and that's not going to change in my lifetime. I don't think 20 or 30 years is remotely close enough, maybe in 100. But so, I mean, I'm just saying you have to also talk about what is feasible.
Right.
It's feasible to make central Ukraine less anti-Russian than they are today, right? Mm-hmm. That would just require buying the media and, giving scholarships and cultural exchanges and all the soft power stuff that for some reason Russia didn't do.
Right.
And I don't understand why. That was part of the earlier part of today's show. I mean, what were they thinking?
Dugin was involved in that very heavily, and one of the main, you have the traditionalist clubs in Ukraine, and what it was is there was, the only way what the Russian plan was to have people like Dugin, and really and specifically Dugin, to try to push these social nationalists who consider themselves third position, basically a type of Nazi or fascist that focuses more on socialism and less on racism. So in that sense, it was already kind of maybe a better development, but it was still they still had this belief that that there was also a third way to create like a TMRN federation, the Black Sea to Baltic concept, and what the Russians were doing, and they might have thought they had more time, but they were having, they were trying to get these third position people to move over towards a fourth position and to get them to be Eurasian. So they didn't have to give up their runes. They didn't have to give up their black sun. They didn't have to give up their sympathies with elements of the Third Reich, because Dugin's package allows you to keep some of those things, you see. But it didn't work out in the end.
Well, I'm going to say that that's for kind of the, I don't know if you want to say fringe, but the edges of society, which is influential, but nonetheless, I think the bigger issue is that Ukrainian
sector.
Right, because Ukrainianism as an idea, Ukrainian nationalism as an idea, not Pravi sector, but I just mean
Ukrainianism,
Kuchma, or for that matter, Yanukovych,
right,
is essentially anti-Russian.
Yeah, the whole like Timoshenko.
In other words, it's okay. Jerry, you're from Canada. I mean, if in Canada you, I don't know, an outside force, Canada got taken over by Russia or I don't know, China, and they wanted to pit Canada against the United States, right? You need to emphasize every possible difference and provoke those differences and make them hate each other, right? That's how you would go about it, right? So that you would try to get Canadians and Americans to find every possible angle of dispute or hatred or whatever, and hype them up and put them in the schools, put them on the media every day. Another day, a Canadian got gunned down in Florida on a visit, right? And you sit there and say, sure, but come on, 25 Americans got gunned down. That's just called America, right? Now, I'm just trying to use that as an example, but what I'm saying is the nature of the Ukraine as a state since independence has been, there's nothing to hold it together in the current borders.
Right,
which includes, it includes all these different regions. It included Crimea. All these different regions.
I think I better understand your question now, and I'm going to try to answer it again if I could. And I think I've been trying to answer it. What I'm trying to say is that this mainstream idea of Ukrainianism, as we agree, is anti-Russian.
Right.
But in the past, and even not that long ago, for example, in 2006, there was a poll conducted. 2006 or 2005, there was a poll conducted before the Orange Revolution. There was a poll conducted, and the 70, 80 something plus % of Ukrainians had favorable attitudes towards Russia. So I think that while Ukrainianism, if we're going to use that word, right, going back to a 19th century German intelligence project, is anti-Russian, I think that the Russians, over the course dealing with the limited resources that they had, not being a global superpower and having difficulty exerting hegemony even in Chechnya and Dagestan and in Ukraine at the time, recall, they're lucky that they held on to Kazakhstan, quite frankly, right? And so this Ukrainian identity is not necessarily anti-Russian. That we can see from the polling, from the mid 2000s that it was neutral to pro-Russian, and it was just it was a media spectacle in the last 7 or 8 years that really pushed this anti-Russian fervor. And what I'm saying is that the uh, uh, you have a spectrum of beliefs about Russia, and if you eliminate or neutralize that far right, vehemently anti-Russian, calling Russians subhuman, if you eliminate that tendency, then it has an overall effect on the mainstream Ukrainianism and makes it more possible to push that back to the type of polling we saw in 2004 or 2006 before the Orange Revolution. So that's how I'm trying to frame that. So that's the connection I'm making between the fringe elements and the mainstream Ukrainianism.
Got it. And I'll give you the other angle then. The other angle is I don't really think it's the media as much as it is the educational system.
I agree.
I ran into a young guy from Kharkov not that long ago who, basically hated Russia. And he'd lived went to school, went to university in Kiev or whatever, and he's a successful guy living in Canada at the moment. He's young, and I think that many people have said, the Nazis said it, you give us your young people. And so when you talk about, let's say, a poll from 7 years ago, the poll didn't include 20-year-olds or whatever, 25-year-olds. And that energy of youth, can really radicalize things. And so I think that it's actually the educational system, not really, the media that's the threat. But that's just an opinion, and I can't prove it.
No. I think that's a good hunch. I mean, it's more than a hunch. I think that's, I think you understand the dynamics of the educational system. And I mean, it was in only the course of a similar period of time, the Nazis built up the Hitler Youth, who then, 7-10 years later, right, were of fighting age, right?
And the 15-year-olds at the end of the war, they're rapidly. Here the war is effectively lost, and here are a bunch of 15-year-olds dying, to defend Berlin or something. And so I think that I think it's partly about the emphasis on young people, and that's kind of what I was talking about, the soft power.
Yeah, it is. The emphasis is on young people, and it's the education system, it's memes, it's social networking. There's been a resurgence of iconography that it's for all of its defects, the Trotskyists generally accurately, talking about neo-Trotskyists in the 90s and the early 2000s, they generally accurately foresaw that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, that in the former Soviet sphere, that radicalism was going to take the form of neo-Nazism. And I think that Orthodox Trotskyist groups were among the first to formalize this and coherently explain the social processes behind that, leaving aside all the other defects they have ideologically and in analysis and so forth. To their credit, they accurately saw that. And you're right, Paul, and it is the youth. But what I see happening is a lot of these youth getting killed right now. It's very sad. Yes. But it's definitely, thinning their herd. And, the numbers...
Well, they're also going to be disillusioned. Like after World War I, all the European nationalism went through a period of extreme disillusionment.
Yeah. And it's about neutralizing. So for the Russian perspective and for the Novorossiyan angle, they need to neutralize these tendencies, send them to the front line and, send them to the meat grinder, and you got a lot of charred bodies, and then the disillusionment back at home. Poroshenko clearly is doing things on a regular basis which piss off these Pravi sector people, and I keep my feelers out there, and I read Pravi sector propaganda. I am a former colleague of actually their chief propagandist, and we weren't surprised she went the way that she went, but she was for a while an acolyte of Dugin as well. And So they are against Poroshenko in all of their propaganda. Now, what's going on behind the scenes is important for other reasons, but in terms of what people believe is that they think they need to stage a second revolution. They feel like they have a stillborn revolution, and Yarosh is saying, hey, these blunders on the front, Poroshenko is to blame, and we're going to take the rest of our forces. They're looking actually, they said a month ago, and I'm not sure they're still going to do it, right? But they're saying that next Saturday, they said a month ago that a Saturday from now, right, on the 12th or so, that they're going to assemble their forces and plan a march on Kiev. And it's going to be, they're making an allusion to, Mussolini's March on Rome. And they want to, like, push Poroshenko to step down, and they want to, recreate this Euromaidan phenomenon, and in their words, do it right this time, right? Which means not being, cannon fodder.
Not having a different oligarch.
Right, not having a different oligarch, and it's the Russians may have an angle there, and they may try to push something to try to twist that in their direction, although I doubt that will be too possible. And that's why I gave you a sort of, out on the limb hypothetical that the U.S. right might back this, march on Rome, this march on Kiev, and get Poroshenko to come down and have a real junta, which publicly the U.S. will denounce and have great concerns about, and the European Union gets to finally all be, together. Both the Eurasianist Europeans and the Atlanticist Europeans can all be on the same side in denouncing this Kiev junta, and the Russians can say, oh, we're glad finally that you've seen what's happened, but they will all know what's really going on behind the scenes, and the fears are going to be in that scenario is maybe that 20 or 30% chance of that happening, that then the U.S. will use that as an excuse. They'll be really secretly arming a Pravi sector and really getting in NATO to do different types of covert operations to frustrate, not so much directly confront the Russians, so much as to just ensure that the country gets destroyed and remains in a perpetual state of confusion and low to medium intensity fighting.
Hey, before we wrap it up, I had a question. Some people speculate that inside the rebel provinces, and possibly other provinces like Kharkov or whatever, a number of young people, like young men in particular, have gone for military training inside Russia. And then they come back and they're, tanned, rested, and ready, so to speak. And they know how to use, how to fire artillery or whatever, things like that, or march together or whatever. And that this is one of the reasons for the dramatic differences in, casualties. Do you think that's going on? Has there been a real training effort that you can see?
I don't have, I can see that as plausible, right? I have no reason to think that seems smart to do. I would not doubt that at all. I don't have any information that would indicate that for sure that that's happening. I have read that maybe that's what the Kiev side has done, and then the only way that they could do any kind of push again is if they had been covertly doing that. But I don't suspect that that's possible. What I really
think the Russians would know. Mm-hmm.
I think the Russians would know, right? Exactly. And so what I do think has definitely happened that explains these astounding Novorossiyan victories has been that the Russians have known where the Kiev forces are going, that there are Russian agents in almost all of these units, that the intelligence network that the Russians have is far better than anything that Ukrainians or NATO has, and that they've given that the recon units have given that information and then disappeared or defected, and that and this has led to these battalions going into situations that they thought they could handle and ended up getting completely encircled and decimated, and worse. So you know, I think it's following the narrative that Russians volunteers haven't been significant. Yeah, then I guess that you would explain that by that, young men from, native to the East have, had military training. I don't see why they would have had to go to Russia to do that, considering how many Russian advisors or how many Soviet era trained personnel and drill sergeants have passed through the Soviet system. People who are 50 years old and up, who are on the Novorossiyan side, would be up to speed on what's current, and would have been able to train people in Novorossiya. I think that Russian satellite and intelligence and other support has been significant. My view is that most of the military heavy arms is native to the East, given all of the caches and stuff that were captured, and the trophies and the defections that took place at different points, especially in May and June. And that explains a lot of where the the Novorossiyans got their good stuff from. Now, I'm quite confident that spare parts, replacement parts, and maintenance equipment has come through Rostov and through smaller roads from the Russian side to help the Novorossiyans. It's all been coordinated by NGOs, and of course, then the Russians, as we said before, get to maintain that plausible deniability, and there's some truth behind their denying, because hey, these are private citizens that are doing NGOs, and so it's like
well,
that.
It's like Blackwater. It's an NGO, right? No, just kidding.
Right. Yeah, right. It's like Blackwater, right? I mean,
It's
Russia
just,
has like its own Blackwater. I mean,
of course.
I mean, as Dmitry Orlov has, explained in his now well-known collapse gap thesis. He talked about it was very popular and quite entertaining the way he explained it. But yeah, there was a whole time in the 90s when there was all private armies, right? And all the oligarchs had their private armies, and so Russia understands the dynamics of oligarchs having private armies quite well, and they don't have to take responsibility for these things. And I think more to the point, as we wrap things up, that one of the big stumbling blocks that Western media has had in trying to prove that Russians are involved is that on the higher levels, the Americans understand perfectly how it is that the Russians are involved for all the reasons that we've explained. Americans understand that. But in the way they report it to the public, they can't talk about it in those terms, because then it shows that that's how things work. And then it shows that that's how ISIS works, and that's how the Americans have been involved in Ukraine themselves, and how all that works, right? So they have to focus on these like stupid claims of, some fuzzy satellite image of like, some vehicles going across a field proving that 1 to 5,000 Russians have entered the country. They have to talk about it in those terms, because to explain the truth, the dynamics of soft power NGOs and covert funding would kind of expose how the Americans do it.
Exactly. And anyway, the other thing is they're dedicated to the lie.
Right. They're dedicated to the lie.
We're facing not just, I guess you would say, flesh and bones here. We're facing a kind of moral, spiritual problem.
Exactly.
And they are dedicated to the lie. But you're absolutely right. And that's why we get these interesting cases where the media are manipulated in certain ways. Like you have some very good articles that readers should check out on your site, Syncretic Studies, because it gets into how the information war is actually working. It's just so complicated. It's difficult to go into this in an interview.
It is.
Yeah. your articles require digestion, so they're a little bit rough to just breeze through. But
they're not quick
that's
reads.
that's certainly the case. I think there are some other possibilities. It might be disinfo, but some people say the only functioning ammunition producer in the Ukraine is in the rebel areas, and that they've put together the money and protection, whatever, to make it work, and that a lot of the ammo and equipment that the Ukrainian army's been using hasn't been maintained for 20 years. Could be a mix of truth and lie in that. I don't know.
Right. It's always a mix of truth and lies. The analogy that I've made to the weapons industry in Ukraine, it's basically like the Irish potato famine. Ireland was producing plenty of potatoes that could have fed all of Ireland, but they were being exported, right? And so it's you had a surplus of potatoes and you had starving Irishmen. And likewise with the Ukrainian military, before this conflict broke out, Ukraine was the fourth largest weapons manufacturer in the world. And most of those, of course, being in the east of the country, outside of Kharkov, at least in the rest, in rebel-occupied areas. So it would make perfect sense that under the right conditions and with the right organization, that you're producing ammunition, you're producing arms, you're producing parts and spare parts and so forth. Why not? I mean, that's how it would go down, and I think that's why certain key targets were so important in this uprising, and why it was the rebels were able to hold on to them. It was very, very silly the way that both Ukraine media and Western media has depicted the territory of Novorossiya, speaking of course in the Donbass area in particular, because they showed maps that they had lost all this territory and they were losing, and the truth is that they were never really losing. All that territory is just like a bunch of like fields and villages and people washing each other's clothes and selling each other plates and dishes and stuff. But the important stuff, Lugansk and Donetsk and the industrial zones around there, were firmly in Novorossiyan hands, and they never thought that in the case of a punitive, anti-terrorist operation in scare quotes, that they were going to like defend every last village in town, for no reason except to like lose people. They always knew they were going to be retreating to certain areas. Slavyansk served its purpose and held on to it for the time that they needed. And when they didn't need it anymore, and when the cost outweighed the benefits, they moved on. But they've held on to what they needed, and it was enough to pull their forces together. To summarize, they reorganized all the militias into what can really be called the Novorossiyan armed forces under a centralized command. Stelkov out, new people in, reorganized, and launched the counterattack as a defensive maneuver, encirclements, surrenders, many, many trophies acquired, and they completely turned the tide in the public mind's eye.
Well, it certainly looks like they've been on a roll, and now we get a ceasefire, so we shall see. Of course, by the time anyone listens to this, it'll be over because it's been more than 10 minutes.
Yeah, it's been more than 10 minutes. I think the ceasefire was over before we started. Well, I think the first thing I said was there never was a ceasefire. But yeah, I mean, there'll be ceasefire talk again. But I think there's no ceasefire right now. But it's.
I think the point I'm trying to make, and you're trying to make, is truth is the first casualty of war. And so the media and all these other angles, it's all part of a war. So don't expect that what you see on the news is remotely related to the truth.
Right, exactly.
Well, I tell you what, Joaquin, we've been almost 2 hours, so I think we've kind of done a good what can we say? Walk in the woods around the whole topic. There's just so much it's hard to cover. But we appreciate you coming. And your website is Syncretic Studies. People can just search for your name and they'll find it. And we thank you much. Appreciate it.
Hey, I'm glad I was here, and thanks for having me on.
Thanks, Joaquin.
Okay. That's it, folks. It's a wrap.